From France, number 14, Michel Platini. Number 15, from Italy, Paolo Rossi. Representing Italy, number 19, Marco Tardelli. From West Germany, number 21, Harald Schumacher. And from Italy, number 22, Tino Zoff. Czechoslovakia, Josef Venglas. The coach of the European All-Stars from West Germany, Jupp Gerwal. And the playing captain of Europe from West Germany, number 2, Franz Beckenbauer.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hey everybody, how's it going? My name is indeed Tim Hanlon, and you have stumbled across yet again, maybe perhaps for the first time, our little curious podcast journey. We call it Good Seats Still Available, and it is our exploration into what used to be in professional sports. I welcome you to the shenanigans, and this week we are stumbling back into soccer. Professionally, of course, and I think a very fun conversation, and especially for folks of a certain age, like myself, perhaps who grew up in the northern New Jersey, New York City metropolitan area during the 70s and early 80s, and fancy themselves as Cosmos soccer fans, NASL pro soccer fans, certainly benefited from a lot of the international soccer experiences that came through Giant Stadium during that time. And interestingly, what transpired in the years afterwards and the various journeys and pivots and divots that the sport of big-time professional soccer took once the NASL collapsed, once the Cosmos went away. Basically, folks who had grown up watching and adopting and becoming interested in this sport suddenly found themselves without mooring, shall we say, even on the world stage, right, with a team that wasn't even qualifying for the World Cup. All of that and more, sort of a tableau, I guess, of an American soccer fan's journey in the embodiment of a person and a book. His name is Michael Agovino, and his book is called The Soccer Diaries: An American's 30-Year Pursuit of the International Game. It has just been re-released in paperback version from our friends at the University of Nebraska Press. It originally came out in, 2014? Yep, I think it was. And I have the hard copy in my hot little hands here. And if you are a current fan of Major League Soccer, or maybe a fan of today's game in some way, shape, or form, whether it be MLS or otherwise, and or remember or were part of the old North American Soccer League, especially the years when it was in, its decline, sort of the early 1980s, after sort of the heyday and the perhaps overexpansion. We've explored that in other episodes. I think you're going to enjoy this conversation, and I know you will enjoy this book, The Soccer Diaries, because this is a real, personal journey of Michael Agovino's to understand what the hell this sport is and was, right? In the United States, right? I don't think is too foreign an experience, a word that I'm pivoting on, but it was and is a foreign sport for many Americans, or certainly was even more so in the 70s and 80s. And I think it's lost on today's generation of soccer fans in this country about just how difficult it was actually to follow this sport once you got hooked, right? For me, the drug was the Cosmos, right, and going to the games. But, once those games are over, how else did you sort of follow the sport? I mean, we talk about things like, the limited availabilities of soccer on television. And by the way, not always in English. The sort of, I guess, almost opaque understanding of the world game in a pre-internet and pre-cable era, right, when information and access to games was few and far between, and not even necessarily live or fully presented. There were little pockets of things that you could get, whether it be Soccer Made in Germany with Toby Charles or watching Tony Torrado on the SENA television network, a Spanish network that, every hour or so during a game, Tony Torrado would sneak in a little English, broken English at that, hello to the handful of American, not American, but English-speaking fans. And then, of course, quickly go back to his rapid Spanish style, right? But at least it was a wink and a nod to this small but hearty group of fans, wherever they might be, who were hooked on this game. And the stories, the travails, the twists and turns, it's a very personal story. And I think it's very emblematic of any soccer fan over the last 20, 30 years who has sort of gone through the ups and downs of being a fan of the sport. And look, we still have some downs and ups still to come. And I think it's all a tremendous backstory for where we go with the sport in the future. Michael Agovino, our guest, coming up in just a couple of seconds. So please, of course, stay tuned and hopefully you'll enjoy it. A couple of quick promo items before we get to that chat. We want to remind you that our friends at Audible offer you a free 1-month subscription to the audio book service that is Audible, the best of breed, shall we say, in things audiobooks, as well as a free audiobook download for you to sample the excitement that is audiobooks across a wide array of 180,000 plus titles to choose from in just about every genre you can imagine. The best place, of course, to give that trial a sampling, shall we say, audibletrial.com/goodseats. Again, that's audibletrial.com/goodseats, and that is your opportunity to get a free audiobook download and a free 1-month subscription to the service. Enjoy it. You can cancel at any time, and we love audiobooks, as you know, and it's an awesome way to support the show. So please do so, audibletrial.com/goodseats, and we thank you for giving them a try. We also thank you for giving our friends at sportshistorycollectibles.com a try. Sportshistorycollectibles.com is an amazing place and a site, and I urge you to bookmark it, go there regularly, and see what proprietor Dean Mitchell has for you to choose from, updated on a regular basis, from the world of forgotten teams and leagues and sports. And there's an amazing array of stuff, whether it be from buttons or pennants or programs or you name it, all kinds of memorabilia from sports and teams and leagues that will tickle the fancy. And hopefully, when you find something that you got to have, or perhaps your friend or your loved one has to have, make sure that you use the promo code that gives us some love in the process. And that promo code is GOODSEATS. Yes, the promo code GOODSEATS at sportshistorycollectibles.com. You will get 15% off your purchases, and you'll be glad you did, as they say. Again, sportshistorycollectibles.com. Use that promo code GOODSEATS and enjoy your your 15% discount. It's not free. That would be something. That would be one hell of a promotion, don't you think, Dean? 15% off your purchases, sportshistorycollectibles.com. Thank you, Dean, and thank you to them as well for their sponsorship of our show. All right, so let us segue into our fun conversation. Here's my chat with the author of the Soccer Diaries, Michael Agovino. This is a conversation I've been looking forward to for a long time, because this is a book that you wrote originally back in, what year did this come out originally in hardcover?
This came out, Tim, in 2014.
Okay, so
right before the last World Cup.
Right. So the book it's called The Soccer Diaries, an American's 30-year pursuit of the international game. And it was, I don't know how I discovered it. It was obviously in a bookstore somewhere, and I saw on the book jacket, right, a sort of a gray/greenish version of what looked like a very full Giant Stadium. And having grown up myself in the northern New Jersey area and having been a Cosmos soccer season ticket holder for quite some time, this book spoke to me because it almost replicates what sort of my experiences were through sort of the journey of what this thing called soccer is and was. Before we sort of get into your journey, your story, and all that kind of stuff, because I think it will resonate with a lot of people for those who may not have grown up in the New York area like we did. I'm curious as to what is the event that is enabling the reissue in paperback version. Have people suddenly discovered it a couple of years later, and the demand grown for it? What do you attest? What do you attribute that to?
I hope it does, Tim. But no, I mean, often in book publishing, the paperback will come out 1 year after it's published in hardback. But because it's soccer, which I think is has arrived. It arrived a while ago, frankly, but it's still not perceived as big a sport as baseball, football, basketball. So the publisher wanted to wait to put out the paperback and wanted to sort of attach it to the World Cup. So they wanted it to come out this spring in 18. So that's why it's been reissued now.
Well, I guess that makes sense, right? Obviously, the World Cup, and we'll get into sort of the United States' absence in this upcoming version. But it's interesting because your book in the prologue basically starts with an international soccer event. That's really kind of your baptism by fire, I guess, in a personal and live way. Maybe you can kind of scene set a little bit as to, maybe we should start this. Let's start with sort of your background in your childhood and what you do as a career now. And then maybe we can sort of delve into the beginnings of that circa early 82 or so, when we begin the story at a jam-packed Giant Stadium.
That's right. And I want to find out if you were there, because a lot of people have come to me since then and said, yeah, I was at that game. And that was August of 82. And basically, I'm from New York, a real New York City kid, grew up in the Bronx, lived there actually the first 25 years of my life, and was a big, just huge sports fan growing up. And my father was from East Harlem, and he grew up loving the New York Yankees and basketball and football, boxing, but not soccer. Even though he was the child of immigrants, he was not a soccer fan. He wasn't a soccer hater at all. And as you know, there were a lot of soccer haters back then, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But he wasn't a soccer hater. He just, loved the American sports. It's kind of how he assimilated. One of the ways he assimilated here in the U.S. Was through sports. And the Cosmos existed, and you probably came to the Cosmos before I did. And I was aware of the Cosmos from the sort of nightly highlights on the nightly news, on the 11 o'clock news. I'd see the goals, and I knew of Pelé and Beckenbauer, but I never went to a game. It was far away. My father didn't drive. So, just Giant Stadium was really far if you had to go by public transportation. And then the 82 World Cup came on, and I didn't even know it was approaching. It was the summer. I was too young to have a summer job. I was out of school, so I had the summer free. And the games were on live on what was called then the Spanish International Network, SIN, SIN in Spanish. And
sorry, actually, SENA. This
right.
And it's interesting you mentioned that, because I vividly remember a young and youthful and enthusiastic Tony Tirado, who would call those games, right, and he would he would nod, he would tip his cap, if you will, to the Anglo listening audience about once an hour with a very broken English salute, I guess, to the English speaking fans. And then it would just go right back to the rat-tat-tat of Spanish.
Exactly. And it was my first, I started learning Spanish through Tony Tirado, actually. And my mother loved it because she thought even back then, Spanish is it's an important language. A lot of people speak it. And so she was happy that, I was watching these games in Spanish and that it would hopefully, I would learn Spanish and it would rub off on me. And also they had the games on the Soccer Made in Germany broadcast, which you, of course, remember on PBS. They had these truncated 90-minute games. They truncated them to 60 minutes from the Bundesliga with a British announcer, a Welsh announcer, actually, Toby Charles, who's kind of a legend to some of us. But then when the World Cup started, they had World Cup games that Toby Charles would announce, also kind of condensed into an hour. So I see these games like twice. I saw them twice a day, basically, and I was just hooked, absolutely hooked. Just a game changer, that World Cup, for me anyway. And then I got into the Cosmos. So I got into the Cosmos late. During that World Cup, actually, and after the World Cup. And then I see an ad in the paper that, the UNICEF and FIFA was sponsoring this, what they call the World All-Star Game. And they billed it as Europe versus the rest of the world. And they really brought the best players over from the World Cup. And not everyone was from the World Cup. Even everyone was really kind of a well-balanced roster on each side. But the stars of the 82 World Cup were there, except Maradona. But Zico was there, Falcao, Rossi, Zoff, Karl-Heinz Rummenigge, Daniel Passarella of Argentina, so many. And I bugged my father, and tickets were $12, I think, for upper deck. And he was like, all right, it's really hard to get there, but I've been told there's buses from the Port Authority. And that's where the book begins, with this kind of prologue, this journey from the Northeast Bronx to Giant Stadium, to my first, live soccer game. And it kind of takes off from there. Then I go back in time a little, and I describe how we played soccer in public school in the Bronx, which, it was a well-meaning gym teacher, but it was this weird, bizarre, they called it line soccer, where you had like 11 or 15 kids on a volleyball court, and there were maybe 6 kids strung across the baseline of the volleyball court. And if you got it through them, that was a goal. So there were like 6 goalkeepers and then maybe 10 field players. It was this insane. He may have made it up, the gym teacher, but that's what we knew of soccer. There were no club teams. There were no other teams to join in the area. And then I learned what real soccer was all about through that World Cup, and then Cosmos games on WOR, as you probably remember, since you're from North Jersey, and Seamus Mallon and Jim Carvelis, and then continuing with the games on the Spanish channel, discovering the Italian games on early Sunday morning. And it became a kind of an addiction from there.
Well, let's talk about that for a second. So let's talk about sort of maybe scene setting a little bit about the sort of early 1980s, both in the sort of New York metropolitan area, sort of life in the city and the environs, right? Because New York City was not necessarily the most robust and booming place, right? There was also the macroeconomic inflation and all kinds of interesting economic issues going on at the time, and also too just the I guess the geography, right? Because you say you came to the Cosmos late, and your first taste of an actual professional game was at Giant Stadium, where they had played for a bunch of years. But I think it's lost on people outside the New York metro area just how expansive, obviously, the geography of the New York metro environment is. And then the role of a Giant Stadium, right, which is this in 1977, 78 was essentially this brand new state-of-the-art, sparkling almost 77,000 seat stadium in the New Jersey Meadowlands, which, it's on the map, it's in the metro area, but if you live and grow up in New York City area, right, public transportation effectively meant a car, right? Which is not public transportation for a whole lot of people in the New York metro area. So maybe a little background into sort of the New York City experience and I guess the little dribbles of understanding of what this soccer thing was all about that even led you to, make that big journey, if you will, to get to Giant Stadium for the first time.
Yeah, well, transportation was a big thing. I mean, and with my family, my mother had a car for, from the early 70s maybe to the early 80s, but she really never used. It was a used car. It was the ugliest car in our neighborhood, a big Buick LeSabre, and she learned to drive late, and she was kind of afraid to drive, so we didn't go very many places in that car, and she certainly wasn't going to go to New Jersey to drive me to a soccer game. My dad couldn't drive at all. He was from Manhattan. So yeah, you had to go by public transportation. And it was one thing to go to Shea Stadium, which was fairly close and easy to get to by public transportation. Even though I was from the Bronx, there was actually a bus right outside my door that went to Main Street, Flushing, for Met games. Yankee Stadium was easy enough to get to. Madison Square Garden was very easy to get to. And I grew up loving all of those sports. I mean, I was just a sports junkie as a little kid, collecting baseball cards, going to Met games. Actually, I grew up a Mets fan, I have to confess. So it was usually Shea Stadium. Yeah, thank you. And it was usually Shea Stadium, some Yankee games, a lot of Knick games. I don't follow hockey anymore, but I was a huge Rangers fan back then. So boxing too was on TV all the time, like great fights on ABC, NBC, CBS. So I was a huge boxing fan too. And then the soccer thing came along, and it took me by surprise. I just fell in love with it. Then I realized Cosmos games were on WOR, the away games. It was always away games, like the Knicks and Rangers. They always showed only away games, and the Cosmos, it was the same thing. And there was no one to play with. There was one kid in my building, and I mentioned him in the book, and we're still in touch. He was Jamaican, and he was like an older brother to me. I really looked up to him because back then New York was, kind of a dangerous place, and he was from a really solid family, but he was also, he was a really good athlete. He was kind of a cool guy, and he played soccer, and he taught me the basics. And I mentioned this in the early chapters. He was 2 years older than me, and he would play alone. He would practice alone in this big high school football and baseball field and track. And he taught me the basics. His uncles came once or twice from Jamaica, and they kind of invited me to train, to practice with them, and that left a good impression on me. And but that was kind of it. It was sort of even though, as you know, there were pockets in the tri-state area of soccer lovers. Your Northern Jersey. Later on, when I worked at Esquire magazine, I worked with a guy from Kearny, New Jersey, and at the time, I didn't realize that was such a hotbed, and that Tab Ramos was from there, and John Hart and Tony Miola, and they had this club team that I learned about. Even in the 80s, I had heard about it, called Thistle FC, which was started by Scottish immigrants. So there were these hotbeds. In Connecticut, I'd heard about it, that there was, good high school programs. Actually, the Jamaican friend of mine, Amani, he went to a really good private high school in Connecticut. So even in those years, we would play together and practice. And then by early August, he was off to his private school, and then I was left alone, and I would just kind of do what Amani taught me how to practice and juggle with the ball and work on my stamina and what have you. And again, without a car, you were kind of, just there wasn't much locally. So it was watching a lot of it on TV, and then in a few years trying to find magazines from England. And but it also it made it fun. It was kind of was like this kind of secret society in a way. And if you found someone, it would kind of, who was a soccer fan, sometimes a workman would come by and see me playing in this vast empty field, and he'd kick the ball with me. He might be from the Caribbean or from Latin America or Europe, and he might kick the ball with me for 15 minutes, and that made my day or made my week. There was an Armenian brothers across it was a huge housing complex I was from, and I would see them kicking a ball from my terrace, and they'd be a half mile away, but I could see them kicking the ball, and I would sort of run down and play with them for an hour, and that would just kind of make your day, and so yeah, it was completely different back then to what it is now, but yet it was kind of magical too.
I think that's a really great way of putting it, sort of that secret society kind of idea, right? Because and agreed, I having grown up in northern New Jersey, I did have a bit more of sort of the we had some soccer leagues for kids way in the mid 70s actually, but that was a rarity, right? And obviously juxtaposed against what exists today, which is a bountiful array of choices for kids to play. But I think it's just interesting and ironic almost in that, here we are, two kids of sort of the metropolitan New York City area with sort of different experiences, yet discovering sort of this game and somehow furtively discovering all the various elements of it and how big this thing is, in an area and frankly in a country that had some soccer history, but certainly not to the level of the major sports that have become quintessentially American. I think that's the part of this story that sort of resonates most deeply with me, and I think with our audience too. Those who fancy themselves as American soccer fans, either this generation or maybe a generation before. The process of discovery and then recognizing or finding others that have somehow on their own gone through that similar journey, right? The discovery of a World Soccer magazine, or seeing somebody who went to a Cosmos game, or it's almost like a brotherhood, so to speak. Once you recognize that somebody else has sort of gone through the same sort of laborious process of getting up early to watch, a tape delay.
Right. That's right. Although the Italian games were they tape delayed? I think they were live, actually.
Maybe.
Yeah. But I know what you mean. Often I put on the Spanish International Network, and you were never sure. Well, they would say vivo en directo, but sometimes you didn't know if it wasn't vivo en directo. Was it same day coverage? Was it from the week before? It was, the Bundesliga game, the soccer made in Germany, were those from that Saturday or the previous Saturday? I didn't at the beginning. I didn't know. I was just kind of watching whatever I could. And let me just backtrack. When I say secret society, I should say a secret society, but an open society too, because in those years, anyone who was a soccer fan, I found them to be so kind of open-minded and welcoming, and so secret society. Maybe I put it the wrong way. It was just very, just very open and welcoming. But yeah, it was just a very niche interest, I guess. But really great people. Any soccer fan I met back then was just, I just kind of immediately got along with them for whatever reason. And these were the days before you could exchange, Twitter handles and stay in touch, and then you might never see them again. But it was something special then, in a way, even though it was rare. But it was special, like you said.
Well, we're also talking about an American media environment, right, which was just starting to kind of break open, right, beyond sort of the classic, 3 or 4 broadcast networks and the handful of TV stations. Obviously, a New York metropolitan area or Los Angeles, et cetera, has a larger amount of TV stations, but that was still a relatively limited thing. Cable, right, television, which was not quite in its infancy, but certainly in its maybe beginning adolescent stages, right? So things like the USA Network and this fledgling ESPN thing, right? So that sports had a few more outlets than, shall we say, some not easily found time slots on public television.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that sort of aided and abetted sort of the more connective tissue, I guess, of soccer fans. But your first major chapter in this book is I think aptly titled "The Dark Ages," right? So roughly 82 from your sort of first direct experience with a professional soccer match to the early part of the 1990s. Do you kind of want to maybe get a little granular, or some of the anecdotes that you sort of talk about? Why do you call it the Dark Ages? And maybe some of the examples that, especially for listeners of ours who are of a certain age, who maybe weren't around at that time, and maybe they understand Major League Soccer and the European Cup and all these kinds of things, but they don't sort of understand how, shall we say, tenuous and/or dark the times were for being a fan of soccer, either the American version or the world version, in this country, when it wasn't necessarily a mainstream kind of activity.
And not only was it mainstream, of course, you could also say, well, it was my enlightenment, my own personal enlightenment, were those dark years, actually, because that's when I just became addicted to it. But the Dark Ages, I should say, I don't think I invented that term, and I don't know where I've heard it bandied about now and again. But just like you say, there was not much of it, and I don't know how you feel about this, Tim. There was a hostility towards soccer among media people too. I mean, among people, a lot of people who loved American sports, and I love those sports too. But there was a lot of hostility towards it, constant jokes about it, and some of them were just jokes, but some of them veered off into kind of nasty territory about it being foreign, it being kind of not masculine, which I talk about in the book, it being somehow other, and I never understood that. To me, I was a small kid always, and I thought, well, this is something I could get good at. I don't have to be 6'2", and I love playing basketball, and I was a pretty good basketball player for a short kid, because I played with good players, and they invited me in and let me play with them, and that's how I got better at basketball. But still, to get really good at basketball, you're not going to be. It's not the short kid who's going to really excel unless you're Spud Webb or someone. But I found it to be an inviting sport, and others somehow, and even till this day, you still kind of hear these things. They find it threatening, and I don't know why. I think it's a great game that anyone could play at any level. And but back then, yes, there were pockets. I'm not from California, but I spoke to I did a radio program the other day, a show called Sports Byline. And the host was probably around my age and was from the Bay Area, and he had very similar experiences. The book kind of spoke to him, and he had similar experiences. In fact, in one of the chapters in the book, I talk about ordering books like The Soccer Tribe, which is a famous British book from the 1970s, and The Football Grounds of Europe was another book I ordered, and it was from a place called Soccer Learning Systems in Pleasanton, California, which is Northern California. I ordered soccer videos from a place in Natchez, Mississippi. I'm sure Southern California always was a soccer hotbed. St. Louis, I've always read. We talked about New Jersey. So it was around, but it not only was it not mainstream, I found it was made fun of, and I took all kinds of crap for being a soccer fan. And even to the point, sometimes you had to worry about your physical safety sometimes. But yet there were the Cosmos. I fell in love with the North American Soccer League. And it had only been in existence at that time for 12 years. It felt to me like it had always been there, but it hadn't been. It was a fairly new league when you think about it. When you think of MLS now, 12 years ago, MLS has been around since 1996. So 12 years ago, it doesn't seem like a long time ago. So anyway, yeah, and then I covered my college team. I never became a good player because I started late. I started way late in my teenage years playing. I loved playing, but I knew I wasn't going to be on a college level. So I covered my team kind of in this very geeky way at New York University, and then again watching the games on the Spanish. By then it was Spanish International Network was gone. It was called Univision, which we all know now, and Telemundo, and again always those Italian games Sunday morning and the highlights show, and they showed it was the Rai feed, and they showed the Wednesday games, which if there was an Italian team in the three big tournaments, which is the European Cup, now known as Champions League, the UEFA Cup, and the Forgotten Cup Winners' Cup, which took me a few years to figure out what that was in the 80s, and if an Italian team was in one of those tournaments, you'd get a game on Wednesday afternoon, our time, live from Europe. And you were seeing great players, Maradona and the great Milan teams as they were rising under Sacchi, and Juventus, and then the teams they played, the Anderlechts and the Real Madrids and etc., Monaco and Marseille and Bayern Munich and Hamburg. And then these teams, as you know, being from New Jersey, they would come to Giant Stadium for these friendlies also, like the Transatlantic Challenge Cup. You'd get double headers of an NASL game, Cosmos versus whoever, Vancouver Whitecaps or Seattle Sounders. And then you'd have two international teams. And I'm sure you went to a lot of those. And those were great. And now there's too many of these summer friendlies, I think, and they feel like money grabs. But back then it was like, oh my God, this is like the greatest thing ever.
All right, just when it was getting interesting, let's bring this to a grinding halt, shall we? Just kidding. We got to pay the bills around here, and our friends at Audible have been very helpful in attempting to allow us to pay some of those bills, and we want to call them out now and remind you that a free audiobook download is yours for the taking, and also a free 1-month subscription to the service of Audible at audibletrial.com/goodseats. Again, audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free 1-month trial of the Audible service, and most interestingly, a free audiobook download for you to enjoy. 180,000 titles and growing every day to choose from, and there's absolutely no excuse to not find at least one title amongst that cavernous selection available to you that you won't find to be enjoyable and good for the soul, including a couple of books that might be interesting to our audience. And yes, some new ones, frankly, that I'm finally listening to. One that I'm listening to right now is by Carson Cunningham. It's narrated by Paul Bamer, and it's called Underbelly Hoops, Adventures in the CBA, a.k.a. the Crazy Basketball Association, which is really, of course, about the Continental Basketball Association, which for many years was sort of this ragtag minor league of the NBA. And it's a book I'm about 2 chapters into right now, and hopefully maybe a guest will get for a future episode. Also in my queue, next up, is another guest that I'd like to get, and her book that she wrote is also narrated by her. Her name is Jeannie Buss, and of course Jeannie is the daughter of Jerry Buss, of course the wildly successful founder of the Los Angeles Lakers and the LA Forum, and Jeannie is clearly today the brains behind the Los Angeles Lakers today. She and her brothers were active, of course, in things like, along with her father, World Team Tennis, the Major Indoor Soccer League with the LA Lasers, all kinds of stuff. So her book is next on my list. That's called Laker Girl, and that too is available on Audible. And again, it's one of the many thousands of titles that you can choose from when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. And again, you too can get your free audiobook download to give it a try, perhaps one of those 2, or perhaps one of the other 180,000 titles available to you as well. Give it a try, audibletrial.com/goodseats. Thanks for listening, and back to our conversation. you're mentioning the NASL, right? And obviously you were jump started, I guess, in the professional game. Listening to some games, watching some games on TV, and actually making that trek to some of those games. But as our listeners know, and folks of the old NASL, would sort of put this in the framework. You became a fan or aware of and more actively engaged with the Cosmos and the NASL just at the very moment, those last 3 years or 2 years of its existence, right? So you almost latched on during its, shall we say, downfall. And maybe you want to sort of give us some experiences of those games and what you sort of felt and what ultimately happened circa 85, right? Which is almost if you will, not only for the league, but almost a collapse, right, of this faith that you've sort of built up, of this sport that you found so intriguing enough to furtively find all these ways to keep in touch with it. It kind of just seemed like it was abandoning you by the middle of the decade, and not just you, of course.
Yeah, and I said that. I think I did a chapter on 1985, and they announced the league was folding, that there wasn't going to be a season, and it's like, oh my God! Like I didn't see it coming. I mean, there wasn't the coverage of soccer. There wasn't, and there was only the tiniest percentage of the coverage of soccer that there is now. So this wasn't talked about. I don't remember them saying the league was in trouble. Maybe in '84 there was some wind of it. There probably was by the fall of '84. But I think, then that horrible Heysel Stadium incident during the European Cup, then the U.S. lost out in the qualifying to the '86 World Cup. Like they lost to, who was it now? Costa Rica in California. There were only 10,000 people there, most rooting for Costa Rica. And the U.S. was eliminated from the '86 World Cup. And I think I phrased it like I lost my best friend. Like soccer felt like it was dead. And that was a depressing time because I was just getting into it and just loving the Cosmos and going to games regularly by then. Not as regularly as I could, and my father could, get away. But that was a sad thing. I had already seen. Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, I was going to say, we also know, though, too, in retrospect, right? So, and unbeknownst to you and, frankly, to me during that time, right, there was a real effort to try to get. Well, I think there was an awareness, certainly in the professional league circles, that things were foundering, and some of that was macroeconomic, some of it was, overexpansion and specific to the league itself, and obviously other things sort of just, conspiring, I think, at the end of the day. The USFL becoming a successful spring football league, et cetera. We can get into that, and we have in some other podcasts. But there was a real concerted effort to get the World Cup in 1986 as Colombia, which was the original designee for that tournament. And I believe people like Henry Kissinger and others in sort of the senior soccer circles made a very significant effort to kind of make the United States sort of the backup plan should Colombia, which obviously didn't happen, be able to sort of follow through. And you wonder, I mean, clearly, so I guess my point is that there are people, who are recognizing that there was some foundering and that perhaps something like a World Cup could be a catalyst to take what began, I guess, in the United States with the NASL to a more sustained level going forward and sort of re-inject, I guess, some of that initial enthusiasm, albeit in pockets, to maybe take the sport to the next level. But sadly, it didn't happen, and arguably it collapsed altogether from these events that you're talking about, circa 85 or so.
Right, and I remember that, one of the pictorial World Cup books I have from '82, the last page is someone has like a Colombian flag, and they're saying, basically, see you in 4 years in Colombia. And I always thought I hope they do get to host that World Cup they were supposed to in '86, but of course, sadly, they had to withdraw. We were talked about at the time. Mexico put on another beautiful World Cup, like the 1970, maybe not as good as the 1970, which was, still maybe to this day the greatest World Cup ever. But yeah, that's interesting. I mean, what would that have changed, in American soccer, trajectory and the interest? Who knows? But it didn't happen. And but then by 1988, I think 4th of July, 88, I have in the book, they announced, the U.S. was awarded the 94 World Cup. So that too was like, and I still couldn't believe it. And I write about this, even as we, in 92, 93, people would, as I met more soccer fans, like, oh, are you getting ready for the World Cup? And I would tell people, I said, you know what? I'll see it when I'll believe it when it actually gets here. I'll see it I'll believe it when I see it, when it arrives here, because I did remember Colombia, was awarded the World Cup, and it was not taken from them. They withdrew, but I thought something could go wrong with the U.S. There was no professional league still. I was surprised that the U.S. got it. You remember there were problems. Giant Stadium wasn't even a finalist, or one of the proposed final 12 grounds, because it was too narrow under FIFA rules. And actually, FIFA made an exception for that. There was wild talk of them building a field above the first 3 rows of Giant Stadium, like a platform, so they could make the field wide enough. But I guess that was too expensive, so they kept the field as it was, and they made an exception. So I thought, there was the artificial turf. Were they really going to convert all these artificial turf fields into, like Giant Stadium and others? Were they really going to make them natural grass? So I was like, I'll believe it when I see it. But luckily it went off and was an excellent World Cup, the '94 tournament. So
before we get to the '94 World Cup and sort of the next sort of chapter of the book, because it's very emblematic. Answer me sort of these twin questions, right? So
sure.
How did you subsist, so to speak, as a soccer fan, given that collapse, shall we say, 85-ish, mid 80s, right? I mean, disillusionment, right? And and I guess maybe similarly, and maybe more importantly, why? Right? What was driving the passion or the interest to keep finding out and sticking with it, so to speak, despite maybe a sense of abandonment?
No, that's a good question. I guess by then, by 85, it'd been 3 years, so I think I was really hooked by then. And there, again, I have to credit. It was still available. So again, the Spanish channels did a great job, and not just showing Spanish-speaking countries. They did. You'd see games from Uruguay and Argentina and Newell's Old Boys against River Plate. You'd see games from Uruguay, from Chile, but they also showed games from Europe. I remember seeing games from Holland in the Spanish on the Spanish channels. So they just did a great job. There was a game, like 2 games, a game on Saturday and a game on Sunday, and the Italian feed from Rai, and you were seeing, the greatest players in the world. Socrates had moved to Italy, to Fiorentina, and Platini, Boniek, Maradona, of course. Those Wednesday games when I'd come home from school, I'd catch at least the second half. Not on the best reception. We still had those crazy bow tie antennas back then, but still, it was something. And there was I got my first subscription to World Soccer, which is still around today, from England. It would come like a month late, but I read it cover to cover, and I learned a lot about the history of club soccer and international soccer from World Soccer magazine. Soccer America was actually hard to find, at least in my part of the Bronx. There was Soccer Digest, which was still hanging around. There was, you remember, there was these little magazines, Baseball Digest, Football Digest. There was Basketball Digest. There was Soccer Digest. And I kept a lot of this stuff too, which is one of the reasons why I thought, let me try doing first a long magazine piece. I did this as a long magazine piece, and then then I thought I could keep going on this because I have so much stuff to refer back to. So that's what kept me interested. And again, you would meet people. I got a job in an amusement park right for the '86 World Cup, and it was again a Jamaican guy, and we would talk soccer, between shifts, and how excited we were that the World Cup was coming up, and every game was live on. I guess by then it was Univision, and Maradona had this great World Cup, and you knew you were seeing someone special at the time. 84, again, SIN showed, I believe, every game live of the European Championships in '84 in France, and that was a great tournament. You had the Danes coming up. They were so exciting. The French team in '84 was better than the '82 team and the '86 French team. They were incredible. So many great games. The Portugal team was good. Spain's team was good. And so that's what kept it alive. Yes, there were no games to go to. So between '84, Transatlantic Challenge Cup, and I think there was the next friendly I went to Giant Stadium was '88. There were 3 South American teams that came, one from Colombia, one from Peru, and one from Ecuador, and plus Benfica. So there were no games to go to except those. But again, I kept running into people, and it would always keep that interest going. And so I have to really credit those networks, the Spanish networks and the RAI feed, and people I met, mainly foreigners. Although there were Americans who liked it, there were American-born fans, but many were immigrants, and whoever they were, it was always a joy to talk soccer for 10 minutes in the street or a half hour, or kick a ball for 20 minutes. And that's what kept it alive.
How about that Cosmos reunion in 1991? I was at that game. I probably saw you there somehow, somewhere amongst the 35,000 folks there.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. I remember that game well, and I have autographs from that game. That was a one-off game. And we somehow got press passes because by then I was working at Esquire magazine. I had just started, and there was an editor there, quite well known, named David Hershey, and he covered the Cosmos in the '70s. He's even in that Cosmos documentary, Once in a Lifetime. He's quite funny in it, and he found out I liked soccer, and he finagled press passes, which probably wasn't really that hard back then because it wasn't necessarily a meaningful game. It was a friendly against the Italy '82, retirees, basically. They were all retired by then, the '82 Italian team, and then these Cosmos and NASL players. And I brought this really great pictorial book, color photography book of the '82 World Cup. And I brought it with me, and we had locker room access. And I went down, and I swear to you, I have autographs from Paolo Rossi, Claudio Gentile, Johan Naskins, Bogicevic of the Cosmos, Seamus Mallon. I had Seamus Mallon, the announcer, who I always really liked. He signed the book. Anyone I could just find, could you sign this for me? And of course, you're not supposed to do that in the press box, but I was really young and I didn't care. It was really important to me to, just stalk these guys and get their autographs. And if it were today, I'd probably get asked for selfies. But that was a fun afternoon. And in those years, even the early '90s were just as quote unquote dark. I mean, there was a 1990 World Cup, of course, but even the '92 European Championships weren't shown on the Spanish channel here. So between the early '90s were tough. Even after '94 was tough. There was still not that much, on TV. The internet was just kind of starting in '94-ish, but it wasn't like it is now. So.
But you were at you were at that press conference though in '92, right? The Waldorf Astoria, when it was essentially announced that some of the logistics and the specifics of the World Cup, and we had Jim Trekker on a couple episodes ago. He was the sort of mastermind of all the press for the U.S. World Cup. A very excellent episode because there's just a lot of stuff. But he understood also sort of I'm going to call it the mission or the crusade, but sort of at least the importance, right, of getting this World Cup right? Not just as an event in the United States and but the legacy. I think that's a word he kept coming back to, that it would leave, right? Promising FIFA obviously to win the bid to start with, right? But truly believing in it, right? Inclusive of a brand new league, a professional league in earnest, that would be one of the key or perhaps the most lasting results of it. But when you were at that press conference, though, right? I mean, you mentioned before, like you said, you believe it when you see it. Well, this press conference felt pretty tangible. No, I mean, did you sense that there was any real sort of pivot or movement, that maybe some real spark and lasting flame, if you will, could result finally, or were you still disbelieving?
Yeah, I was not disbelieving. I was still skeptical because I wasn't sure of that there would be a lasting legacy. I knew eventually Americans would catch on because it's such a great game, and it was about just exposing younger people to it, I think. But again, we'd heard that before. We heard that it was the most popular sport among kids. Like, right? Growing up, it was like, soccer is the most popular sport with, 8 and 12-year-olds. And we heard that in the 70s, the 80s. So, yeah, the press conference, they gave us goodies. They gave an Adidas bag that was actually really good in black and green. And I used that bag until with holes in it. So they gave us goodies, and it seemed real, and they did get the World Cup right for the most part, actually. But I was still, again, it was tough getting, and by then I was in the media, and I saw how people would react when you would pitch an article on soccer, and it was still a long way to go. And actually, there's still a long way to go, to tell you the truth. But the World Cup, yeah, that did change things. It took a while, I think, still after the World Cup, but yeah, it was not a great World Cup, but a very good World Cup, and it went off without a hitch. And it did. I kind of hate the word legacy, whether it's about politicians or sporting events, but I think that it left a lasting legacy, the '94 World Cup, for sure.
Well, you do talk, you do sort of corral this sort of second chapter of this book, and you do call the '94 and beyond to about 2002, 2003 era as the Renaissance. So maybe you could frame that, but again, both personally as well as sort of your observations of sort of what was happening to the sport that you came to love and stick with. Maybe a little sort of framing of sort of why you call that the Renaissance. It's probably very easy to kind of say, 94 World Cup, restart. But, you're mentioning actually, I think, a pretty interesting divot in the post-World Cup hangover, shall we say. Successful, more money. I think it's still the most financially successful ever run. But the idea of Major League Soccer, right, was still not fully formed. And actually, I think it was supposed to start in 95 originally, was the original plan.
That's right.
And didn't get going until 96. And even then, it was still, a lot of head scratching. So maybe you can describe sort of how you sort of characterize these next 9 to 10 or so years as sort of a renaissance, and your understanding of why that was the case.
Well, it did put it on the map here. Again, it was always kind of on the map for some people and some communities, but this did give it a national exposure. I mean, more than it had ever had before. When you think about the '82 World Cup final, yes, it was shown on ABC, but they had commercial breaks. I think that was the only game they showed of that '82 of the World Cup. '86, there was a few more games. '90, I don't think there were any games on national TV in the U.S. In '94, Bill Clinton, I think, was at the opening ceremony. Maybe he was kicking balls around. I think he played in college a bit or in high school. So you started seeing it in different ways. And yeah, MLS was started in the spring of '96. 6 later than they expected. But it was something. And then, then more, it wasn't just that. I mean, more games were televised from Europe by then. You could go to certain bars, at least in New York, and see, by then it was the Premier League, not the English First Division. It was the English Premier League, and they would show live games in certain bars. And that hadn't been the case before. That was one of the, if I could just backtrack a bit, when I went to NYU, I was involved in the school newspaper, and I did an article on the Sporting Club, which was the first sports bar, it's hard to believe, in Manhattan. And I did a story on it, and I asked the owner, what's your most popular event? And I was expecting he'd say the Super Bowl or March Madness or something. And he said, you wouldn't believe it, it's the FA Cup final. And I said, you're kidding me. I didn't even know you showed the FA Cup final. He's like, yeah, it's packed. You can't get into the place. And these English guys are drinking screwdrivers at like 10 in the morning. And
earlier than that.
So then I went, earlier than that, right. So then I went to the next one, I think, at the Sporting Club, and he was right. It was packed, and that was the only place that showed the game. But by 94, you could see English games. And jerseys weren't a big thing then. They weren't even available yet, jerseys, in 94. But, there were more games from Europe in bars, at least. And if you remember, the Copa America in 1995, the U.S. and Mexico were invited as special guests, and the U.S. had a great tournament. They finished, I believe, 4th. They made the semifinals, and that wasn't on TV at all. So it was really almost like a step back those couple years after that. You put it well, that hangover after 94, and then the internet really, started to become the internet, and there were just more. It was just more available by the later 90s.
Well, I think also media too, right? We go back to media, and that media is, and the world of the business of television and media is my day job. So I have an understanding of that a bit, and explosion of cable and many more outlets, and the need to feed the beast of programming. Obviously, this is still before the internet, really, right? But still, you've got all these now dozens of channels versus just a handful, right? So there's actually some window of opportunity to get some of this stuff out there, right? And a deal with ESPN to get to be the Major League Soccer's thing, and a deal with, I think it was Univision at the time still, and still is now. This is a brand new league, and it's programming, and it's 8 to 10 markets, and you wonder. It just seems like some of the broader macroeconomics and industries out there it made for a more fertile soil, perhaps, to get a league like this off the ground, perhaps even more so than even just 5 years prior to that.
Absolutely. Without question. You said it perfectly. I mean, there was interest, there was thirst, there was hunger for soccer, and it was just growing, and it's still growing. And I still think the sky's the limit for the U.S. Despite this huge setback. And I'm not really a flag waver. I remember when I saw my first U.S. national team game in 1984 against Italy at Giant Stadium, a game you might have been at. It was raining the whole game. It was a Wednesday.
It was pouring.
Actually, it was pouring. Oh, you were there?
Oh, yeah.
It was pouring. I got so sick after that game. I don't think I've ever been sicker. I didn't have to go to the hospital, but I had such a flu. And there were still 50,000 there. And that was my first U.S. national team game. And I remember Marco Tardelli, a hero from the '82 World Cup. I think I still have the articles from the New York Times. I think he said, really look out for the U.S. because they're going places, this team, So, but of course, they didn't make the '86 World Cup. U.S. now this huge step back, but I still think the sky's the limit for the U.S. And I'm not. Again, I meant to say I'm not a flag waver for U.S. soccer. I think I'm I see the potential, but I can be critical when I need to be. But I still think the sky's the limit. I mean, you see, and I'm not the biggest fan of Major League Soccer either. It never grabbed me the way the North American Soccer League did, or the European leagues. And I know they use this term Euro snob. There's nothing snobby about me. And the friends I talk about in the book, we were not snobby. We just, wanted to see great soccer. And if it was in South America or Europe, or if the players were from Africa or Asia or wherever, that's kind of what you want to see, And but I still think, what's happening in Atlanta and the Pacific Northwest, I still think it might not be my favorite league. I think tactically, it's really behind, way behind the European leagues tactically and technically. But I still think there's great potential in the U.S. and the interest is here. I'm getting ahead of myself. Maybe I'm skipping over some years, but
I want to. So maybe we could round off the conversation around that. So you're obviously you have a longitudinal viewpoint, right, of sort of the current state of the professional game in the United States, right? And there is obviously a new generation of fans that are either ignorant or actually now I'm starting to see actually curious about this sort of ragtag history, right? So some of the old North American Soccer League names, now being adopted by or continued by an MLS, and the interesting embrace or re-embrace of that heritage and culture, to the extent that it existed. So, I mean, and so we've had plenty of guests, both who played in the NASL and have been part of MLS and all this kind of stuff, who, there is sort of this belief set around, what is it about Major League Soccer? I mean, on one level, right, you mentioned the Atlanta Uniteds and the sellout crowds and the new stadia and all that kind of stuff, right? And it's an amazing boom time in many respects, right? The real estate projects and franchise values, and Cincinnati now, building a new stadium and, going from a USL club and stuff. And you could make the argument, right, that there is, this is a boom time, right, both at the minor league level and at the major league level. However, right, to your point, I would agree. I think some of the quality of play, I try to get connected to it. I've been a Chicago Fire fan for some time, but I haven't gone to a game in the last 4 or 5 years simply because I live in the suburbs of Chicago, and it's a 90-mile round trip down to the south suburbs. Right. Wow. So my passion as I've gotten older and a family and all that stuff, right? I mean, I will go out of my way to watch it and try to follow it. But am I or you possibly guilty of looking in the rearview mirror and saying, it's just not the NASL and the Cosmos? Or is it something more than that and maybe the collective ownership of the league and not being independent teams and promotion relegation and all these other, and or the quality of play, the U.S. not making the World Cup? I mean, is there something that's holding it back from maybe being sort of even more passionately successful, I guess?
Yeah, I think it's not the former. It's not looking back at the Cosmos with rose-colored glasses. Although those were great times, and for some reason, and the league was only 12 years old when I came to it. It grabbed me the way MLS never did. Although I tried on many different occasions with MLS, and I did have some good times at MLS games. Don't get me wrong, but it's the second point you made, and I just think, and it's not easy. I mean, it's a huge country. We should have 4 divisions all connected. I mean, we should, and if we did, I think soccer becomes the most popular sport within 10 or 20 years, if not less, frankly. And it's okay. Also, Americans have this idea, like if you don't pack a stadium that's 76,000, like Giant Stadium, or whatever, 50,000, you're a failure. And I've been to games in Europe, 4th division games where there's 200 people and the players are like fighting at halftime. It's that competitive. And if Omaha, Nebraska has a team and it's 4th division and they attract 500 people, like there's nothing wrong with that, And maybe they'll have a great Hollywood story one day where in the cup they'll, beat DC United and make the quarterfinals of the U.S. Open Cup, and how great would that be, So again, I think really Americans, if I could be a little critical here, I think as a Serie A fan for the longest time, the word tactics comes up a lot, and you kind of don't realize tactics can be very boring, actually. It could be watching people play chess, but it's still very important, and it doesn't make for exciting soccer always, but it's important. And technique, little things about technique that start from a very young age that someone like me, like when I would get the ball in a game, I would do all these nice things in practice. I loved juggling the ball because I would have to play by myself in those early years. So I became a great juggler of the ball, which looked nice, but in a game, it does mean something. It's about touch, as my Jamaican friend Amani, his uncle, told me back in the early 80s. He said, never let anyone tell you juggling isn't important. It's about touch. But still, when I would get the ball at my feet, I would panic because I picked the game up a little too late. And these things have to be taught from good coaches at a very young age. And I think that's something that we still, don't have. We lack great coaching and it's really a sophisticated thinking regarding the tactics. And also, still, the best leagues in the world are in Europe. I'm sorry to say. And the best Brazilian players eventually, get to Europe at a fairly young age. And the best African players, Asian players, what have you. And not enough U.S. players are there. And I know a lot that upsets a lot of people, but that's my view anyway. And Jurgen Klinsmann had said this, and he was criticized for saying it. But you have to be in these Champions League type teams. Or Europa League teams even. Look how great Atletico Madrid is. How great would it be if American players were under Simeone, Diego Simeone. So again, great strides were made in this country, but there's still a long way to go. But it's been great to just kind of take it all in and watch it and see it develop.
Yeah, I don't get a sense from you that this personal journey in and around this sport has been a futile exercise or a waste of time.
No, it's been a joy. There's been some frustrations seeing it, especially media, being that I'm in the media, to see who gets to cover it, who has a voice. So there have been some frustrations, but, just seeing the fan interests and where there was very, very, very little back in the 80s and 90s, and to see it really kind of take off. And now it just feels so mainstream now, to see someone walking down the street with, a Manchester United jersey. Now you see Borussia Dortmund jerseys and kind of, at first when jerseys became popular in the late 90s, early 2000s, you just see a few teams, Manchester United and Chelsea, Arsenal, Real Madrid. But now you see all kinds of jerseys.
Including FC NYC jerseys that cost something on the order of $85 to $90 at Modell's. So,
Right.
the influence of big money, even for Major League Soccer teams, that to me, that's the sort of thing I worry about most is sort of, I call it corruption or whatever, but, big money, right? We see it Major League Soccer, right? A lot of this is rooted in economic revenue streams, real estate projects, stadia, that kind of stuff, right? Which is all well and good. It's the word, I guess, is infrastructure, which I think is important and good for sort of the longer lasting success of the sport. But I also, of course, get a bit cynical when we sort of see the merchandising coming before, say, the quality of soccer on the pitch or centralized control of a league when, maybe more independence of franchises and a little bit more, shall we say, on-the-ground innovation that could spark more, I guess, genuine rivalries and passion. The artificiality of that, And again, I understand it, right? I mean, given the history of this, the checkered history of this sport in this country, right? You can and people like yourselves, right, who can appreciate having gone through sort of the very dark times, right, when it was just a chore to actually be a fan of the sport in this country. In some cases, yes, an embarrassment of riches, but you can't manufacture authenticity and passion. And
No,
I think
not at all.
one of the narratives of this story that you've written is a passion, right? Your own personal sort of journey and experience, and falling in love with this sport, and doing all the things that one needs to do when one falls in love, right? Despite all the odds. So in many respects, it's the best of times, but it's also, I think, depending on your perspective, a bit of the worst of times when, quality of the play. We haven't made the World Cup this year after, I wonder what your thoughts are about what sort of the next, decade or two might look like for the sport in this country, given your experience with the sport, both through good and bad times.
Yeah. I don't know. I honestly don't know. I think it's still, I think the World Cup, first of all, I think I sent a tweet when the U.S. was eliminated that, this could be the start of something good in a way. But then again, not really. I mean, Bruce Arena writing a book that's, I guess, just out. I haven't read it. I've read reviews of it, and him criticizing the system when he's part of the system. And Bruce Arena has his qualities. He got the U.S., to the quarterfinals in 2002. It's the best World Cup performance the U.S. ever had. So you can't take that away from him. He did well domestically, but I don't know. He's, to me, part of the problem. And I don't know what the future holds. I just know there's interest here, and it doesn't. If you're not an MLS fan, yes, it's nice to go to a game and support your local team, but you could put on, again, I touch on this in the book, even 10 years ago, where back in the 90s even, you had a choice of just one game or two games a weekend. And now you have, my God, any game basically you want. And I guess on streaming, you could probably watch the J League or the K League from South Korea or the Australian League. I don't even know. I imagine you could, but there's so much choice now. You could just say, I'm going to watch Napoli games or Arsenal games, and that's fine too. If someone just wants to watch Arsenal games, I don't like Arsenal, but that's their choice, and that's fine with me. I'm not going to, and if someone just wants to watch DC United, I'm not going to, I mean, there are these wars on Twitter, on soccer Twitter, that are incredible. But if someone wants to watch DC United games, that's up to them. I'm not going to yell at them. My team is Roma. We had a nice season. We made the semifinals for the first time in Champions League ever, or for the first time since 1984. And that was nice. I didn't expect it. So I don't want anyone yelling at me for being a Roma fan. And I've gotten that too from Americans. Like, how could you not support? I used to really like the Metro Stars. I really try to engage with the Metro Stars and Red Bulls, but I don't know, it just never stuck. So where is it going? I'm not sure. I just know that people have really fallen for the game the way I did all those years ago, and I just see the interest and love for the game will just continue. What that means for the pyramid and the league and the national team, the women are already best in the world or close to it, always in the top in the mix to win the World Cup. The men, that's going to be a ways away, but that doesn't matter. I mean, Holland didn't make the World Cup, Tim. Italy didn't make the World Cup. Chile, Ghana didn't make the World. Really great pedigreed teams didn't make this World Cup. So England didn't make it in '94, and then they, the Premier League has gone to be the most, at least popular league in the world. I don't think it's the best league, but it's the most popular. And England had a good '98 World Cup following that. So France didn't make it in, 90 and '94, and then they came back to win it in '98. So I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't think it's the end of the world. I think leadership needed to change, and it needs to change more, I think. But what happens beyond that, I'm not sure.
Well, spoken like a true fan, and I can't recommend this book enough. And why don't you give our listeners a bit of promotional goodness for the book, where they can find it, and your other exploits and/or social media stuff. How can they learn more about you and/or the book?
Yeah, well, basically, it's called The Soccer Diaries, an American's 30-year pursuit of the international game. It's published by the very good people at the University of Nebraska Press. It's an excellent press on many different levels. They do great baseball books, especially. And this very open-minded editor took a chance on me after he read this article I did in a literary magazine called Tin House. So I'm really grateful to the folks there. You could get it at the University of Nebraska Press website or Amazon or barnesandnoble.com. And actually, could I tell you one quick tidbit
Absolutely.
about the Cosmos about this? We're probably running out of time, but
go right ahead.
This was a really odd coincidence, and it caught me totally off guard. The day it came out in 2014, I think the official pub date, I could check on Amazon, I don't even remember, it was maybe May something, the end of May 2014. And that day, maybe it was the day before or day after, I think it might have been the exact day, I had a job for the World Cup, like a 3-month job at a new network called Fusion, which was owned by Univision. And a few of us, they put us in a hotel to work for a couple months in Miami or outside of Miami, Doral. And a few of us went to Fort Lauderdale to see the Fort Lauderdale Strikers versus the New York Cosmos. And I couldn't believe this. I thought I was seeing things. And who was there like a couple rows from me? And you would remember these guys, 2 Cosmos, Chico Borja and Richard Chinapoo. They were sort of from the later years. And Chico Borja played for the U.S. national team. He was Ecuadorian American, and he played for the Cosmos, a really good midfielder. And he also played on that short-lived Team America, where they had the national team play as a club team within the NASL. And they were out of Washington, D.C. So Jeff Durgan moved down to Team America, Chico Borja. And I feel sorry for this generation because they were kind of the lost generation. They were some good players there, Steve Moyers, Ricky Davis, and they never got that chance to play in the World Cup. And next to Chico Borja was another Cosmo named Richard Chinapoo, who was actually from Trinidad and played for Long Island University. Really nice, elegant player, and he played for the Trinidad national team. And I couldn't believe, I recognized them, and then I was sure it was them, and they're both mentioned in the book. And I thought, how weird is this? Like, I've never been to Lockhart Stadium in my life. Great little stadium, by the way, in Fort Lauderdale. I'd seen it all those years. Yeah. I'd seen it all those years ago on Cosmos games, and there I was. And there's Chico Borja and Richard Chinapoo. And I somehow became a 14-year-old, and I was like too nervous to approach them. And I was going to say, hey, you're fondly remembered in my book that just came out today. So if by chance they ever hear this, maybe they should open it. Because they were really good players. And yeah, so that's my little Cosmos remembrance about the book. And the Cosmos.
Yeah, I was going to say, 2 guests we wouldn't mind having on the show. So Hernan Chico Borja, obviously the Cosmos, but also quite an adept player indoors with the Wichita Wings, et cetera. And Richard Chinapoo, who also went on to a very solid indoor career of his own, I think, with the Baltimore Blast, and I think a bit maybe with the Cosmos when they had their dalliance with indoor and stuff. So we love, if you guys are listening, by all means, not only buy the book and/or get another copy of the book now that it's out in paperback, but let's also get you on the show. I think it'd be great. Cool dude, that Michael Agovino. No question about that. And not only a cool dude, but a cool book. It is called, as we referenced, The Soccer Diaries, an American's 30-year pursuit of the international game. It is published by our friends at the University of Nebraska Press. The original version is in hardcover, came out in 2014. I'm sure you can find a few copies of that floating around, but the reissue, the paperback version, is just out and just in time for to accompany, if you will, your World Cup viewing coming up. So you'll find links to the book on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode with Michael Agovino, and you will find a link to it. And by buying through that link on Amazon, you'll give us a little love financially and keep our little show going. We appreciate that. Michael, as he said, is also followable on Twitter. And again, this is look, if you remember that being a soccer fan in the late 70s and early 80s, and then frankly beyond, once the NASL collapsed and times were not necessarily as rosy as arguably they are today. And it's a great look back, and I think it really sort of sets the scene for appreciation for what we have today, and perhaps a bit of editorial critique on how the sport has evolved, perhaps where it might go in the future. And I think it's really important for any person that calls himself a soccer fan, this great sport, about where its future lies in the United States, will benefit from and enjoy reading Michael's book, The Soccer Diaries. Thank you to him. We thank you, of course, our dedicated and devoted listeners. And if you're new to the show, by all means, make sure that you continue to learn more by going to our website. As mentioned before, goodseatsstillavailable.com. You'll find all of our old episodes, which you can download. You can obviously find all the places that you can subscribe to us on iTunes or Spotify, or you name the places. We're probably there and out there. And also, you can follow us and interact with us on our various social media feeds. At Twitter, you'll find us at GoodSeatsStill. On Instagram, you'll find us at GoodSeatsStillAvailable, and you will also find us on Facebook, a little page devoted to us as well. You can send us email by going to our website and all that kind of stuff. There are a plentiful number of ways to find and connect with us, and we love it when you do. We appreciate all your cards and letters, as they say, and all your suggestions and your engagement in the show. We can't do this without you, and I'm amazed literally every week to discover new people, nooks and crannies, and geographies, people from all over the world, for whatever reason, discovering, finding the show, reacting to it, resonating with it, believe it or not. And we appreciate that, and it keeps us going. And please, by all means, continue to let us know what you like, what you don't like, and perhaps even some suggestions and stuff too. All right, I'm done. My name's Tim Hanlon. Thank you so much for listening. More fun and frivolity coming at you hopefully next week. And until then, we bid you a fond adieu. Take care, everybody.